know about this one?
I've only heard people refer to it like about 1,000,000 times.
Yeah, I know. It's
Like
like to be.
like, are you Melon Mays? Is she Melon Mays? I'm like, no.
But how can you be Black in academia and not
I
be?
like, no. Hi, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to Getting Woke with Dr. Chi. In this episode, I continue my discussion with Tamara Walker, in which she just discusses how she decided to become a historian and ended up moving from studying race in a really, really white place to studying race in a place that has a lot more Indigenous people and Black people as well. So I hope that you enjoy this conversation that we have. I think it's full of a lot of good little nuggets, so enjoy. You are Associate Professor of History at the University of Toronto. You are the author of the 2017 book, Exquisite Slaves, Race, Clothing, and Status in Colonial Lima. And you're like working on a new book project. But I want to talk to you about like your whole trajectory. Like, how does, Black woman Tamara Walker decide that she wants to be in a very, very white ivory tower? What's your trajectory of like deciding to become a professor?
Oh, that's a good one. So I was thinking about this the other day because I remember I had gone to college wanting to be a teacher or a lawyer. I didn't really have much of an idea beyond those two things because those were things that were familiar to me, like not having had family who went to college. I was like, I have teachers and I know people whose parents are lawyers. So those were the two things that I thought were for me. And then I actually got to college and I was like, nothing about what I'm studying seems to prepare me for a career in law. And so I just didn't really see a way forward with that. And I was enjoying teaching. I had done this program. It was called Summer Bridge, which was a after-school program and a summer program for low-income students from around the country. They had local programs. And so I did one in Philadelphia where I went to college. And I thought that was super fun. But then I remember my stepdad, who is no longer in my life and wasn't like legally my stepdad, but like my mom's long-term partner, was so annoyed that I was going to this Ivy League school and was going to come out a teacher. And he didn't even have like an 8th grade education, but it was something that clearly meant a lot to him that I get, I think, an advanced degree. I think that was the main issue. But so yeah, I was like, well, I do like teaching and I like research. And then it happened that I really liked Spanish because I had gone to high school where I got to take Spanish classes and I got to travel to Mexico. So I was like, okay, is there a way for all these things to combine into a career? And as it happened, this was around the time that the Mellon, what was then called the Mellon Minority Undergraduate Fellowship Program was kind of on the scene. It had been around for a while, but it was coming on my radar around the same time. It's now called the Mellon Mays University Fellowship. Do you know about this one?
I've only heard people refer to it like about 1,000,000 times.
Yeah, I know. It's
like
like to be.
Like, are you Melon Mays? Is she Melon Mays? I'm like, no.
But how can you be Black in academia and not be?
Like, no.
I became a Mellon Fellow in my sophomore year. Maybe it was my junior year. And the whole idea behind the program is to increase the diversity of faculty at colleges and universities in the US. So it supported me being able to do independent research. I had a faculty mentor at the time. And then I wanted to go to Argentina to do more research kind of related to what I had been working on in my independent research. Anyway, my mentor at the time was really encouraging of the research, and it just got me really interested in Argentina and seeing it with my own eyes. And it happened that Penn had a program through Butler University where you could study abroad in Argentina. So I ended up being able to spend a semester there with the support of Mellon. Like, I think they helped me pay for a plane ticket. Like, I was on financial aid, so that covered the tuition of it. And then I applied to grad school because I had such a weird and uncomfortable experience in Argentina, trying to do research on race and national identity. I think that came up while I was there, where I was like, okay, why is everyone staring at me? Why is this place so white? I didn't expect any of that, even having studied the history and understood that there was a history of European immigration. It still didn't dawn on me that it would be such a white place and that I would stand out being Black. So that was kind of the path to thinking about race and national identity in Latin America.
How did you end up like studying Argentina? It's a very, very white place. And going to like the other side of South America, if I remember correctly.
There were two things that happened. One was that before I went to Argentina, because the semester wasn't starting until March because their seasons are reversed, I had all this time to kill where I couldn't take a full semester of courses at Penn. So I was at home until the study abroad program started. So I had like 2 months from like Christmas break to when the program finally started to just get myself together for my semester abroad.
Oh, okay.
And during that time, I was like, I need to make some money so I can like enjoy my study abroad experience, maybe do some travel. And I worked at this Peruvian restaurant that happened to be owned by the family members of some kids I went to school with. And they were like, why would you go to Argentina when you could go to Peru? They were always like trying to kind of get me to see Peru as a superior place compared to Argentina.
No bias there, I'm guessing.
Oh yeah, they were totally biased, but they were making really interesting points that ended up shaping the course of my career, because they were like, did you know there were Black people in Peru? And so they would bring in videos about like the Black presence in Peru and just talk about it as a place where there were Black people and they were acknowledged as part of the country's fabric. And that was before I got to Argentina. So when I got to Argentina, was really aware of the contrast between like how these Peruvians talked and how these Argentinians talked about Black people and talked to Black people. Because in Argentina, what was happening to me at the time was that people assumed I was Brazilian, which in turn meant they assumed I was a sex worker. So there was always just weird stuff happening. But every time I wanted to talk about Blackness in Argentina, people were like, well, we don't have any Black people. And that's not something that we deal with here, except for when it comes from outside, like from Brazil. And I went to Argentina in '99, and then I was in grad school.
1900s, as my students like to say.
In the 1900s, in the old 20th century. And then I got to grad school. I feel like students say that to just get to you, right?
I think they honestly mean the 1900s. It's so distant for them, you know, but it's just not distant for us, because those were like
so aggressive.
That was like our heyday.
It was exactly. Argentina, and I was like, everyone's telling me I'm barking up the wrong tree trying to study anything related to Black people. And then I kept having Peru just kind of pop up as a place that I had never gotten the chance to go, even when I was studying abroad in Argentina the first time. So it was kind of by putting those paths together that I ended up studying slavery in Peru. But yeah, it was this path that now feels like it couldn't have happened any other way. But at the time just was kind of like, well, I guess we'll see what happens.
Oh, that's such an interesting thing. Because like when I think about Black people in Argentina, I think about George Reed Andrews' work on like the Afro-Argentines and like their erasure from Argentinian history. I'm wondering if like that's what you were coming up against. People like, oh, they don't exist here. But like there's clearly documentation that they did at some point and had either like become racially mixed so that they became white over generations, or other processes happened, such as like, I don't know, murder, the military wars, death.
Yeah, there was a sense that it was part of the country's history, but not part of the country's present in the 90s.
Okay.
And yeah, so it was the aftermath of everything that George Reed Andrews was describing in his book, The Afro-Argentines of Buenos Aires. It's different now, right? Because I think that work has had wider visibility and more people have begun to build on that work. And there's also been more shifts in kind of national discourse that more directly acknowledges the history of Africans in Argentina. And also there have been more recent waves of immigration from Senegal, for example, and Cape Verde, even though Cape Verdeans have been in Argentina since the 19th century. But there's been a kind of more visible Black presence in Argentina, coupled with a wider recognition of Argentina's Black history. It's still interesting that it was just a reflection of a particular moment in history, right? A particular moment in my life, but also a particular moment in that country's history. Well, in my particular case, it was a source that I found in a library in Michigan, actually, the Clements Library on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And I'd gone with one of my professors. I was taking an English class, actually, and the professor had us go to the Clements Library and basically let us loose. Maybe she gave us some parameters, but the idea was like, see what you can find here, which I think is perfect preparation for archival research of any sort. And I happened to come across this travel account that was published by a woman named Ida Pfeiffer, this British woman who had made a trip around the world in the 1850s and ended up in Peru. And one of the things she talks about when she gets there is how shocked she is to see the milk and fruit women, she refers to them as, and she talks about them as having black and dark brown faces and wearing elegant clothing like silks and laces, but it's more or less ragged and hanging half off. And she describes them as looking like pigs with gold necklaces. And in that, she's invoking Don Quixote, or she's saying that she's invoking Don Quixote, but she's kind of putting her own spin on it. But she's basically saying that these women are ultimately and kind of essentially inelegant, no matter what they're doing with their self-presentation. And so that's what got me interested in the subject of clothing, because I was interested in who these women were and how they got their hands on these clothing items. She gets there in 1856, so it's 2 years after the abolition of slavery. And so
what year was that?
She gets there in 1856, and slavery is abolished in Peru in 1854.
Okay, so it's before the United States.
Right, so it's before the United States. It's still relatively late in the hemisphere. It's not the latest because there's the US, there's Brazil, obviously. Because yeah, this British woman is being really disparaging of them and describing them as pigs with gold necklaces. But how did they see themselves and how did they carry themselves? And so that became the kind of seed for what became my dissertation and which became Exquisite Slaves, that moment in the library at the University of Michigan, which is really cool to think about in terms of how, sometimes we think about, especially for historians of Latin America or of other countries outside the US, that there isn't material in the US for us.
Right.
But there's so many libraries and archives and repositories that have all kinds of really amazing information that we can use to just understand these other parts of the world and how people from other parts of the world saw some of those places, because that's ultimately what I was getting from that travel account, a sense of how this British woman saw Peruvian women. So it's a story that starts in the 18th century and goes until the abolition of slavery, to kind of think about the changing meanings that clothing had for enslaved people, free people of African descent, and those who presumed to control them, and not just slaveholders, but third-party whites and mestizos who thought that they had a say in how these people should dress and carry themselves.
Were there other examples of like Native people from like Lima and how that contrasted with how the Black who lived there saw themselves in terms of clothing?
Well, I talk about the fact that wealthy slaveholders in Peru took a lot of pride in how they outfitted their human property as extensions of their own wealth and status. So a male slaveholder or a female slaveholder would dress a male or female slave in ways that were not about the enslaved person, him or herself, but about the slaveholder or the enslaver. And so they viewed their human property as extensions of their own wealth and status and prestige, kind of canvases for the expression of their own identities. But it meant something different, and it felt different to be wearing silks and to be wearing velvet and to be wearing shoes in an environment where to be enslaved was to often go shoeless. And it was funny because I was writing this at the same time that I was waitressing and like bartending. And I remember having to wear uniforms for those jobs. And they're always just really boring uniforms, like black pants and white shirts. And they always felt really androgynous. It got me thinking about sort of how uniforms manage to erase one's sense of individuality and what it would feel like to be able to not wear a uniform and to kind of, or to embellish a uniform, because I was always really into jewelry when I was wearing uniforms, or when I was like working for catering companies that we'd really have to look like penguins. I would be really into jewelry or makeup. Like the whole idea of like
the white
black.
and the black.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
But then the other part of it was trying to find sources where I could hear something from enslaved people. And it happened that criminal cases, they had a formulaic nature that meant that you could hear enslaved people's testimony. And they kind of had a biographical function.
So slaves can actually testify in court.
They're testifying and they're being interrogated. So it's, where were you on the night of XYZ? Did you steal this item? well, such and such says you did. And then there's testimony from other witnesses that can fill in the gaps. And there was always really interesting kind of insight coming from the witnesses. Some of them were neighbors, some of them were family members, some of them were enemies and rivals. And they would say, well, I knew that he stole that clothing because a poor slave couldn't afford such luxuries. And so then you would sometimes hear from them these kinds of stories like, well, I did give my niece some stockings because I loved her and I wanted her to have something nice.
What was your most surprising finding?
There were still elite Spaniards who would openly violate sumptuary laws by dressing their human property in silks and laces. And so on one hand, they wouldn't want to see free people of African descent wearing this elegant finery, but they would want their human property to do it. They would want enslaved people to wear it because of what it would say about them as elite Spaniards.
What?
Yeah.
How dare you wear a lace? How dare you wear a bonnet? Like, what are you, my overseer? Slavery's over.
Slavery is over.
So, Tony, what are you working on these days? So that was like your last book project. What about these days? What are you doing now? What you doing?
These days, I'm more of a dilettante. So I am working on a couple different projects. One came out of that project because a source base that I worked with for Exquisite Slaves was these visual representations of people of African descent in their clothing. And I got really interested in this genre of Costa painting that had been produced in Peru, because when we usually think about Costa painting, these depictions of multiracial families, mothers, fathers, and children, we think of the Mexican context because most of the Costa paintings were produced in Mexico in the 18th century. Whereas in Peru, there was just a small collection of them that were produced, just 20 images, or I think maybe 16, no, 20 images. And they didn't circulate within Peru, they were sent directly to Spain. And so I have a whole chapter where I talk about the images and the story behind them and the story they tell. But I started to get really interested in representations of Blackness in Latin American visual culture, not just in these Peruvian Costa paintings, but in really every era of artistic production since the 1500s, basically. Colonial portraits, including Costa paintings, but not limited to them, photographs from the 19th century, advertisements that emerge in the middle of the 20th century, and more kind of contemporary imagery. There is a through line that I'm following, not just in Peru, but in other parts of Latin America, that have people of African descent serving these important symbolic roles in the presence of white subjects who are often meant to be the central subjects of the images. So I came to this project both from the Costa paintings, but also from this photograph that I saw in a magazine in 2011. And it was really, maybe you heard of it because it was like really controversial when it came out. It was a profile of this wealthy and connected Colombian family, and it was this multi-generational family. And it was kind of an early girl boss type of article because it was all about the women in the family, the great-grandmother, the grandmother, the granddaughter, and the great-granddaughter, and their ties to the business and fashion industry in Colombia. And so the cover story, and it was in Hola magazine, which is like hello or people, it was meant to be a puff piece. And the cover image for the family was, these 4 generations of women, and they're all wearing like button-up white shirts and designer denim, and they're on the terrace of their family estate in Cali in Colombia. And in the background of the image, and these are all white presenting women, perhaps of Lebanese ancestry, and behind them, standing in profile, are these 2 Afro-Colombian maids, and they're wearing maids' uniforms and holding tea service sets. And it's an image from 2011. And a lot of people were like, it has resonances of, the history of slavery, that it reduced these women to kind of ornamental status. Like that was some of the critique that was coming from Afro-Colombians at the time.
Right,
and to me,
I don't remember this incident at all. I don't think I was paying attention back then.
Well, and maybe if you saw the image, you would either like hear some of those arguments or just be able to imagine them, because it's such an egregious image. And the fact that it ended up gracing, the cover of this multi-page puff
Oh,
piece.
wait, you didn't say that it was on the cover. You said it was an Ola magazine, but it was on the cover of
It wasn't on the cover of the magazine, but it was like the lead photo for this like multi-page spread for the family. So it was meant to like welcome you to the world of these women. And there was a whole kind of dust up that surrounded it in the Columbia media, but also because it was a period when, images were starting to really circulate on the internet. It became this sort of global thing. And so that's how it ended up on my radar. And I was just really interested in it from the perspective of someone who has studied images in the colonial period, that it looked so familiar to me, even though I hadn't seen it before. I'm like, it looks like an image from the 18th century, and it's doing the same sort of work as an image from the 18th century, not just in terms of signaling the kind of subordinated status of these African descent people in the 18th century enslaved, but in 2011 free, but also telling us something about the white women and making them sort of white in a certain way too. So that's what I'm interested in now, just kind of thinking about both Blackness and whiteness and indigeneity in Latin American visual culture since its earliest formation in the colonial period to the present. So
wait, from the early colonial period, 1500s to the present, as in 2021. We're gonna cover 500 years of like.
Yeah, it's a different sort of book. And I'm using kind of key images that speak to particular themes and ideologies and historical moments per era.
But then you got something else going on. Tell us about what else you got going on, Tamara.
The other thing I got going on is a travel book, and it's a book that kind of blends elements of memoir and history, and it kind of comes out of the experience I was talking about in Argentina when I studied abroad there, and just felt really on display in a way that I wasn't prepared for, and unmoored in a way I wasn't prepared for. And I was prepared in lots of ways for the experience of studying abroad. Like I had studied Spanish for so many years, and I had studied the history of Latin America for so many years. So I felt like I was pretty ready to tackle this experience, and felt really overwhelmed by what I didn't know and that I really couldn't know until I got there myself. And so it's kind of born out of that experience, an opportunity to talk about that experience, but also to connect my own experience to a larger experience of African Americans going abroad and grappling with how differently they're perceived and received in different parts of the world, and how it shapes their relationship to the US, both while they're away and once they return to the US at different moments in history. So there's the memoir element, and then there's the kind of collective historical element that touches on different people in, I guess, Black history, both known and unknown, who have traveled to different parts of the world at different moments over the past century. So that's a smaller time frame than anything I've worked in, even though that's a huge chunk of time.
Well, that's it for my conversation with Tamara Walker. Please check out her book, Exquisite Slaves. That's all about race and clothing in colonial Peru. Also, please be sure to subscribe, like this video or this podcast, and share it with your friends, share it with your enemies, and share it with your frenemies. I hope to talk to you in 2 weeks. Take care.